You're listening to episode 219 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Alexander Wynne joins us to speak about creative engagement with tradition and his newest book, Buddhism, An Introduction. Just today, the latest issue of Buddha Dharma arrived in my mailbox with a cover story about the mindfulness movement. The piece was introduced by my friend Jenny Wilkes, who, like many of us, lives in the two overlapping, but perhaps growing apart worlds of Buddhism and mindfulness. What does that mean for the tradition? And what are some of the important questions around creative engagement with contemporary society? Alexander Wynne, former student of Richard Gombrich, is currently lecturer in Buddhist studies at Mahidol University, Thailand, and a translator for the prestigious Clay Sanskrit Library. He is the author of Buddhism, An Introduction, The Origin of Buddhist Meditation, and Mahabharata Book 12, Volume 3, The Book of Liberation. So sit back, relax, and have a nice jasmine tranquility. Our guest today is Alexander Wynne. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Ted.
So glad to be speaking with you, particularly about some of the topics we're going to be touching on today. But let's get started by having you tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm from the UK. I finished a BA degree in theology and religious studies in 1997. That was at Bristol University. Then I studied an MPhil at Oxford University in classical Indian religion and did a DPhil, mainly on early Buddhism, which I finished in 2004. So after that, I spent a bit of time as a research fellow in Oxford. And since 2007, I've been out in Thailand and India teaching and researching.
And you're doing something a little bit different right now. Where are you?
Yeah, so now for the last 3 years, I've been working in the Dhammakaya temple in Thailand. What we're doing is we have a project to re-edit the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon is the only surviving complete record of the Buddha's teachings and early Buddhist teachings in India that is in an Indian language. You have Chinese and Tibetan translations, but there is nothing complete and nothing else complete in an Indian language. If you look at the history of these things, the previous work on it has been done fairly well, but there's plenty of ground for improvement. So we're gathering a lot of manuscripts from the Theravada countries and then, trying to put the text back together as accurately as possible.
Wonderful. I want to hear a little bit more about that towards the end of today's conversation. So let's talk about your book. It's just out, Buddhism, An Introduction. Tell us about that. What made you decide to write this particular book?
Well, I didn't, at this stage, I've still only been in the academic games, I suppose, since I finished my PhD is about 10 years ago. I had no desire or ambition to write an introduction. But my former teacher at Bristol University, Paul Williams, he was asked if he would like to write one. He's already written 2 introductions on Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is quite well known. So he was a bit fed up writing introductions and asked me if I would like to do it. So I thought, okay, this is, a point I think that I have a few things to say and I could possibly get something like this together. So yeah, then I thought, okay, I'll try and do this.
And so tell us about what's in the book itself. What do you have as the contents?
Well, when I started to think about what this sort of book could be like, I didn't want to just write another introduction book because there are a lot of, very good introduction books on Buddhism. So it didn't seem to me that there was any point restating facts that everybody knows about now or can easily find out. You can turn on the internet and find out about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So I thought I would try and do something which situates all of these ideas and these practices in the historical context and sort of brings it to life a bit from within. So I've tried to do a book which is a bit more, there's a lot more detail and a lot more new ideas in there. And I've not set it out as, here are the facts. I've tried to explain what was happening and why the Buddha came up with, the Four Noble Truths, for example.
And before we really dive into the heart of what we want to talk about, which is, I think, a latter part of that book, I also wanted to briefly mention a previous book of yours, The Origin of Buddhist Meditation. And I was wondering if you'd tell just a little bit about that book as well.
So that book is, that is based on my PhD thesis. It is an attempt to reconstruct from the historical sources what the Buddha, what is historical fact and actually what happened with regard to the Buddha and his strivings and his teachings on meditation. So when I was researching these things and reading the Pali texts, I found a few old verse texts which, they're translated, but I still couldn't understand them. And where the Buddha is in dialogue about these pretty difficult sort of advanced meditative states. And he's explaining, someone's questioning him. He's trying to explain, and respond to the questions. And there are a lot of metaphors being used, and all of the language seemed to me very historically rooted. And unless you could find out the historical context, it doesn't really make sense. So I tried to go back to a lot of the other texts around the time of the Buddha and do a historical reconstruction and try to make sense of, what the Buddha's ideas were on meditation. Where did it come from?
What did you find on some of that? I'm curious.
A lot of it was based upon this tradition that the Buddha was taught meditation by 2 teachers. And, the texts say that one teacher taught him, a path culminating in the state of nothingness. And then another that he attained the state of neither perception nor non-perception.
Alara Kalama and Dakaramaputra, I think.
Yeah, that's it. Those 2 figures exactly. So you have these figures, that pop up and not much is said about them in the early Buddhist texts. Nothing is said outside the Buddhist text. But, if you look at the accounts, the only plausible explanation is that these were historical figures who had teachings and they were, existing in some sort of religious or philosophical context at the time of the Buddha. They had followers. The Buddha studied under them. And so what did that actually mean to attain the state of nothingness or neither perception nor non-perception? So I was trying to figure out what these ideas meant to the Buddha and, why he rejected them.
What came up from that? What did you find?
Well, these things are, reconstructions like this are, I suppose, a bit theoretical. But, my explanation is that these 2 teachers, they existed in a sort of mystical Brahminic or Upanishadic milieu. And they are teaching something in line with what you have in the early Upanishads, which is that meditation is all about turning your awareness within, the concentrated tradition. You cut off your thoughts, you turn your mind back in on itself. And you try, in doing this, they say that, you can get to the source of the cosmos, which, in Brahminic texts, they term Brahman. Is like, this is the cosmic absolute from which everything comes, and that is the ultimate aim of everything. So the terms nothingness and neither perception nor non-perception seem to be just ways of articulating this idea, of getting back to the source. And the Buddha went through this. He was acclaimed as, the texts say he was acclaimed as a master of these types of meditation. And then he rejects them. And somehow he has the idea that, well, I've attained these states, but I don't feel that I'm at the end of the path. And then he sets out on a whole different sort of inquiry.
So let's go into really what we want to get into, which is this creative engagement with the tradition that we need to see in the West. And I know you have some good thoughts on this, and in fact you see it as a bit of a necessity in the West. So tell us a little bit about what you're thinking along that and what interests you most about it and what you'd like to see.
Well, I suppose just to put this in perspective, I start out in this introduction book by looking at what was happening in the beginning and why were some people so moved by the Buddha. And my conclusion about that is that Buddhism is the first truly universal religion. Lots of people have universal ideas, but not everybody has this agenda, this urge to take these ideas out to the people. And Buddhism is a missionary religion. It is the first of its type in the world. So you have these very profound and universal ideas and this urge to take it out. And, Buddhists are wandering preachers and meditators. And so when it comes to the end of my book and I sort of discuss what is happening in the West, I still think it's the same sort of urge and attraction which is animating people. I suppose the basic thing is that you have a universal religion and a universal imperative, by which I mean Buddhism is engaged. It is about, you have teachings that you have to give to people. It's not just about sitting in a cave and meditating. So, my basic perspective on what's happening in the West is that at the basic level, it is just a re-expression of some very old values. Obviously, there's a lot more happening than that and how we reinterpret and understand the values and ideas. But in terms of actually the fact that Buddhism is in the West is not at all surprising because, Buddhism in the ancient texts, it is the community of the four quarters. It is something for everybody, and everybody should do their bit to try and take it out there. So I think Buddhism coming, especially in the US, it's a fairly vibrant scene at the moment. There are a lot of historical precedents for that.
So where do you think this is going? Are we seeing the development of another kind of Buddhism?
I think so. I don't think we're there yet. In my book, I compare it. I think the best example is what happened when Buddhism moved into China about in the 1st century AD. So you had all the ideas that were moving into China, you getting now moving into the West. And in China as well, it was a pretty advanced and developed civilization. So you had a civilization with its own worked out values and way of doing things. And Buddhism is moving into that. In India, ancient India was a bit different because the civilization, Buddhism and the urban civilization sort of grew up together. So I think if we look at what happened in China as a guide, you would say that, at some point there are going to have to be new schools, just like there were schools of Chan or Pure Land Buddhism or Huayan Buddhism. That is going to happen. And I don't think it will be too far off because, in life in the modern world is accelerated. Things happen really quickly.
So what are some of the qualities you think those new schools might have?
Well,
$64,000 question, I know.
Yeah, well, just let me get my crystal ball out here. It's hard to say. There's lots of things happening, I think, and it's hard to say which trend is going to be important. At one extreme, you have a lot of people, which I don't think is written about enough. In practitioner circles, it's, taken for granted, but the attraction towards, Buddhist ritual forms, especially in Tantric Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, that's pretty popular. And that is not exactly, when you write about Buddhism and Buddhist modernism and what is happening in the modern world, you talk about the ideas and things which attract modern people, being rationalism, being, maybe compatibility with science. But there's also this thing that people want, to have some ritual culture back, which has sort of disappeared from the modern world. So that's one trend. The other trend, of course, then you have the rationalists, all of the modernizers like D.T. Suzuki, even the Dalai Lama, promote Buddhism as a rational thing compatible with science and the way modern people think. So you have a lot of things happening. I suppose the most creative things that are happening amongst secularists who are trying to actually build new Buddhist philosophies. I don't think that's happening quite as much elsewhere. I mean, there's a lot of meditation, there's a lot of Vipassana, there's a lot of Tibetan Buddhism, but who is actually thinking the new ideas? And ultimately, for Buddhism to take really deep roots, you have to have a philosophy as well as the meditation.
And I don't see that there's a lot of that specific kind of conversation going on. It seems that there's a dearth of that, with the exception of certain groups like this one and some other important people who are doing the work. But does it seem to you as well that this is a bit of a gap in that creative conversation?
Maybe it's a gap, but, Buddhism is really having converts in the West for around 100 years. So in terms of the history of these things, that we're not doing too badly, I suppose. It took maybe 500 or 600 years for an original school of Chinese meditation to arise, the Chan school. And then they had, thoroughly sinicized Indian Buddhist ideas and practices. So I don't see it as a gap as much as just something that hasn't happened yet, but is on the point of happening now.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to take that long for things not to develop? I think development is probably very rapid, particularly with social networking and global computing, all that. I don't think it's the development that is going to necessarily take a long time, but what about its solidification?
Well, yeah, I mean, to have something that you could call a school, you need a lot of different things coming together. Okay, you can't just have a meditation center. You have to have shared, doesn't have to be rituals, but it has to be a shared practices, shared beliefs, just a lot more things being shared and sense of unity. So there are different things happening in different communities. And I think we're still waiting for, someone to bring them together. I mean, I'd say a prediction would be that this century we would have something, say a modern American equivalent to the Chan school in China, emerging maybe from a Vipassana movement with, some creative engagement with Buddhist philosophy. I think it is not too far away.
Let's shift a little bit back to your current work today. What is going to be the planned outcome of your work?
Well, I'm doing work in two areas. I mean, I still have my ongoing research on early Buddhism, which I just do all the time. My day job is I'm working in the Dhammakaya temple. It's a traditional Buddhist temple, and all the people here I'm working with are either members of the temple or they're Burmese or Sinhalese monks. So they have very traditional motives in that for them, the work we're doing is about preserving the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon, this very early and old record. So we have different perspectives, and it's sort of a meeting of East and West, you could say. I'm bringing a bit of modern academic method to this, and they're providing the traditional method. The Burmese and Sinhalese monks all have traditional monastic education, so they're very good in, their knowledge of the Pali Canon and the language and literature. And so to that, I'm bringing a bit of modern linguistic know-how, I suppose. But the goal of the project is that we produce an improved and new edition of the Pali Canon with a lot of the mistakes taken out. I mean, you have translations of things which have been printed now in, the West for over 100 years. But the job in the beginning was not quite done well enough. To really get a good representation of a Buddhist text, you need maybe 20 or so manuscripts, whereas in the past they would use maybe one or two, which any single manuscript is full of mistakes.
So I'm looking forward to see some outcome from that. Alex, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Well, I mean, my own interest in Buddhism goes back to, before I went to university. I actually went to university to study at a place that offered good courses in Buddhism because I wanted to know about it. I was originally studying sciences, and I suppose my involvement, dates back to feeling not entirely satisfied with the sort of things that I could get to know through science. I remember when I was about 17 or 18 and I was, saw some documentary on TV by Richard Feynman about him. And, his philosophy of science saying that what we're doing is we're just producing theoretical models which explain, the results of experiments better. And what we know now will be superseded in the future by different theories. And so I felt with that, okay, of course, it has to be like this. Nobody's ever explained to me, how they know that an electron spins around a nucleus or something. But it has to be, this is completely true, but therefore science is not going to give me the sort of understanding of the world which, the sort of thing I was looking for. So I started looking into religion and philosophy, and Buddhism is something that seemed to appeal for its directness. I suppose you could say it's, the rational aspects of it, the Four Noble Truths. Also the romance of it. I like the idea of people leaving the world and sitting under trees and attaining nirvana. So I don't know what you secularists make of that, but I think a lot of people are attracted to the romance of it, apart from, the ideas, which are really good. But the meditative thing is, I think for many in the West, is coming from this, I don't know, maybe you could say romantic urge, or as modern individuals, it seems to fit into the way we look at things very well.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. For many of us, our initial inclination towards the practice was through an aesthetic. Not all of us came to this through suffering, as many have, but because we were interested in what this was about. And for some, it was more the calling towards the practice rather than an ideal of nibbana. And for some it is. And that's, we're all going to have different reasons for us coming to this practice. And really it's, for secularists, our thread tends to be, and of course there's some variability in this, is what does it mean to what we do in the world? Whatever your beliefs are, whatever your practice is, what does that mean here and now, what you're doing? So ultimately, it's okay however you got here. It's fine. It's what are you doing with it now? And how does that impact what we do with each other every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a gap, if you're being dramatic, you could say there's a spiritual crisis, the West has lost its soul, etc. But for some reason, we are at this stage where you could say it's a sort of age of nothing or an age of everything. There's all sorts of things going on. There's no overriding metaphysic of how we view the world or what is our place in it. So this is a sort of unique period. And I don't know, maybe this was a bit like it was in the Buddha's time. The Buddha came from a small tribe, which is the tribal world is disappearing. The tribal values are disappearing. And how do people respond to that? They sort of go a bit nuts and leave the world and sit under trees, or they, try to starve themselves and do all sorts of things. They're searching for values and how to respond to this new situation. So I think exactly the same thing is happening now. And I think with secularists as well, mainly because the spiritual crisis of the West is that the idea of God doesn't make sense anymore. So a lot of people are turning to Buddhism as this non-theistic sort of way of doing metaphysics or religion.
Yeah, and for many, they're doing that as an approach to deal with suffering, whether it's their own or suffering of the world. Perfectly valid. For some, it may also be a dissatisfaction with the tradition they may have been raised in, for example, that let them down in some way. And so they're looking for something else, but they've just replaced one set of ideological structure with another. That they're using many of the same arguments and pushbacks that are also used in other settings. And so the arguments of, well, because so-and-so said so. Yeah, but that's what your other tradition said that you didn't like, and that was not a satisfactory answer to you then. Why is it a satisfactory answer to you now? And I'm not seeing quite enough questioning on that part when there is that replacement. It's an understandable one. I get it. We're wired that way, and that's something that when there's a hole left in your life, something that was very important to you, there's a normal need to want to fill that. And it's difficult for us to approach that with some criticality and some open awareness about what it is we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, what impressed me when I was writing this book was that starting at the beginning and then, finishing right now, what is happening now. So when I started to look at, the modernist trends and, things we call modernist Buddhism or whatever, there's all these many things going on. And the most interesting things I find would be the writings of Stephen Batchelor or, things of this sort. There is another fairly good book by Owen Flanagan, The Bodhisattva's Brain. So, I mean, but then, where is that sort of effort going? I mean, I believe that Stephen Batchelor is writing a book called Beyond Buddhism. This is interesting because the conclusion, I sort of asked, well, if secularized Buddhism is Buddhism that accepts the metaphysics of science, accepts scientific materialism, can it stay as Buddhism? And maybe Stephen Batchelor now is thinking, well, you can take all the wisdom of Buddhism and you can take it outside of its cultural home and the ritual and material culture of that, and you can apply it within the modern world, and then it doesn't have to be called Buddhism. So, I mean, that is one development which is happening. So it makes me wonder, will secularist Buddhism survive, or how many different approaches to secularism can we create within, Buddhist modernist circles? Or will it become a sort of humanist school of contemplation?
Yeah, however we think about it, it's going to be an interesting next few years.
I hope so, yeah.
Well, the guest today has been Alexander Wynne. Alex, thanks for being on the podcast. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Ted. Great speaking to you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.